Snow on the crazy mountains, wind coming down off them with teeth in it. Now closer, a homestead in the white, a thin line of chimney smoke standing straight up in the still, cold air. Closer still to a window where a woman with honey-colored hair stands with flour to her wrists kneading bread and does not look afraid. She should be afraid, because far down the long road a black horse is coming, silver on the bridle catching the gray light. Watch the hooves, steady, unhurried, the walk of a man who has never once arrived anywhere he was not already certain to own. Inside behind her the room goes wrong. A young man stops reading. Another puts his back to the wall. A polite knock. 3 taps. She wipes her hands. She reaches for the door. And somewhere under the floor beneath a stone, a dead man's secret waits to be read. The night she knelt in the snow beside a fresh grave, Adelheid Brandt was not crying. She wanted you to know that. Later, when people in Yellowstone County told this story, and they told it for 40 years, they always got that part wrong. They said the German woman wept over the dark mound of earth while the wind came down off the crazy mountains like something with teeth. They said she clutched the leather book to her chest and shook. She did clutch the book, but she did not weep. She was doing arithmetic. Cold, exact German arithmetic, counting how many lies it had taken to fill that grave, counting the men still breathing who had told them. And behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him through her wool coat, stood a man 6'6" in his boots with a rifle held low and easy at his side. He was not pointing it at her. He was pointing it at the road. Remember that too. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand why a woman who came 3,000 miles to be a wife ended up on her knees in the snow beside a grave with a rifle at her back, you have to go back. Back to the morning her old life ended and her real one started. Back to a train platform in September. Back to the moment a tall, silent stranger looked at her and got everything wrong. If you are new here, settle in and tell me in the comments what town you are listening from tonight. Then, stay with me. Because this one does not end where you think it does. She arrived on the Northern Pacific on the 14th of September, 1882. Picture it. A wooden platform bleached gray by sun and wind, a water tower, a single rail of iron running off toward mountains, so big and so blue they did not look real, they looked painted, they looked like a thing a child would draw if you told the child to draw the end of the world. Dust everywhere, dust in the air. Dust on the boards, dust settling on the hem of a blue traveling dress that was everyone could see a little too fine for this place. Adelheid Brandt stepped down from the passenger car with 2 suitcases and a violin case. She was 26 years old, 5'8" in her stockings, which in that country and that year made her taller than most of the men watching. Honey-colored hair pinned up under a hat that had also been too fine once in Chicago. Eyes the exact blue of cornflowers and just as unbothered. She had a face people called handsome, before they thought to call it pretty, and she preferred it that way. She had decided something on the train. She had decided it somewhere around the Dakota border, watching the grass roll on with no end and no fence and no mercy, and she had not changed her mind since. She had decided she would be absolutely nothing that this man had ordered, whoever he was. Because a man who orders a wife the way other men order a plow or a side of bacon by mail, with specifications that man has a picture in his head. And Adelheid Brandt had spent her whole life being other people's pictures. The dutiful daughter, the quiet seamstress, the grateful immigrant, the girl who said yes. Not anymore. So she stood on that platform, with her chin up and her 2 suitcases and her violin, and she looked at the cluster of men by the depot, and she waited to find out which one had paid for her. It was the big one. Of course it was the big one. 6'6" if he was an inch shoulders like a door frame, a man built on a scale that made the depot behind him look like a toy. He came forward slow, hat in his hands, which surprised her, dark blonde hair gone darker with sweat at the temples, a jaw you could have built a barn on. He was not handsome, the way the tintype had promised. The tintype, she would learn later, had been taken in better light and a better mood, and had added a good 20% to his charm that the man himself had no intention of honoring. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a long moment, and he said nothing. So she spoke first. "You are shorter than your photograph suggested," Adelheid said, "but your chin is better in person." Now, a great many things could have happened next. He could have laughed, he could have scowled, he could have turned around and gotten back on his horse and left her standing there with her too fine dress and her violin. And frankly, she had half expected exactly that and had a plan for it, which involved the return ticket folded small in the lining of her glove. Instead, the big man blinked. Once. Slow, like a man recalculating a sum he had been certain of. "My name is Ransom Calder," he said. That was all. 3 words. And in those 3 words she heard a voice deep and quiet and careful, the voice of a man who did not waste breath. And she filed that away, the way she filed everything away, because Adelheid Brandt forgot nothing ever, and that habit was going to matter more than either of them could possibly know. "Adelheid Brandt," she said. "My family called me Della. You may also." Della. He tried it. It fit his mouth strangely, the foreign shape of it, and he frowned at the strangeness, like it was a tool he had not used before. "We have a ways to ride." He reached for her suitcases. She let him take them. She kept the violin. The wagon ride was 11 miles, and it took the better part of 3 hours, and in that time Adelheid asked Ransom Calder 14 questions. She asked about the water source. He said, "Creek." She asked how far to the nearest neighbor. He said, 4 miles. She asked about the nearest church, the nearest doctor, the nearest town with a store that sold books, whether the winters were as bad as people in Chicago had warned her, whether there were wolves, whether the land was paid for or mortgaged, and whether he had always lived alone. He answered 12 of those 14 questions with exactly 1 word each. The 2 he did not answer were the one about the mortgage and the one about living alone. Noticed both silences. She was good at silences. She had been raised by a quiet father and a dead mother, and she knew that the things people would not say were always more interesting than the things they would. "You are either very efficient," she told him, watching the side of his face, "or very dull. I will determine which by Thursday." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not a smile. It was the distant cousin of a smile. The rumor of one, but she saw it, and something in her chest did a small and unwelcome thing that she chose to ignore. Then they came over a low rise, and she saw the homestead, and she saw the men. There were 2 of them waiting in the yard. And that was the first thing Ransom Calder had gotten wrong. Not on purpose. Ransom Calder, she would come to understand, did not lie. It was almost a sickness with him, the not lying, a hard, stubborn honesty that had cost him plenty over the years. But he had let her believe by saying nothing, the way honest men sometimes lie best, by saying nothing, that she was coming to one man's house. She was coming to three. The cabin sat against the shoulder of a hill with a barn behind it, and a chicken coop leaning tiredly to one side, and a woodpile stacked. She noted with a frown, all wrong, stacked, so the bottom logs would rot before spring. Smoke rose straight up from the chimney into the still gold evening, and in front of it stood two men who were unmistakably, from the set of their shoulders and the cut of their jaws, this man's brothers. One was younger, mid-20s maybe, lean, where Ransom was broad with a quick open face, and a book she saw, an actual book, tucked into his belt like other men carried a pistol. He was grinning at her before the wagon even stopped. The other was harder to read. He stood a little apart, 30 or so. There was something coiled about him, the watchfulness of a man who learned young that the world could not be trusted, a way of standing, so his back was never quite to the open. He did not grin. He looked at Della the way a man looks at weather coming in off the mountains, calculating how much trouble it was going to be. Ransom drew the wagon to a stop. "Della," he said. "My brothers, Asa, the young one with the book, and Eli, the watchful one." Asa was already coming forward. "Ma'am," he said, and there was real warmth in it. "We are glad you have come. We have been hoping." "Asa," said Eli, just the name, low, a warning. The young man's mouth shut, and Della, sitting up on that wagon seat with the gold light going long across the yard, felt the first cold finger of something she could not yet name trail down the back of her neck. "We have been hoping." Hoping for what? Because a man who is lonely hopes for a wife. But a man does not say, "We have been hoping," three of them, all in it together, with the oldest one going stiff and the watchful one cutting the young one off. That was not the language of a lonely bachelor. That was the language of men who needed something, something specific, something they were not going to tell her. She climbed down from the wagon before any of them could help her. "Well," she said, brushing the dust from her too fine skirt with 2 brisk strokes, "someone show me the kitchen. Whatever it is you three have been hoping for, you will think more clearly after supper." That first night she cooked for them, not because she was told to, because she wanted to see them. And the best way to see men, her mother had taught her in the years before the fever, took her the best way to truly see men, was to feed them and watch how they ate. So she made what there was: salt pork and beans and a pan of cornbread, and she did it well, with the precision of a woman who had cooked in a Chicago boarding house for 6 years and had no patience for waste, and she watched. Asa ate fast and talked between bites, words tumbling out of him, asking her about Chicago, about the train, about whether it was true there were buildings 6 stories tall, about the violin, especially the violin. Did she really play? Would she play sometime? He was 24, she learned. He read everything. He had taught himself Latin out of a borrowed primer and was working through the law of all things out here by candlelight, because he said, and then he stopped himself and glanced at Eli and did not finish the because. Eli ate slow and said almost nothing, but he watched her hands. The whole meal. He watched her hands the way you watch the hands of a stranger at cards. When she reached for the coffee pot, he tracked the reach. When she set down the knife, he noted where she set it. It was not rudeness, it was something worse. It was assessment and ransom. Ransom ate like a man who had not been cooked for in a very long time, carefully, almost reverently. He did not talk, but twice she caught him looking at her across the table with an expression she could not read at all, something between gratitude and grief. and both times he looked away the instant she caught it. When the plates were cleared, Della sat back down at the table. She folded her hands, and she said the thing she had been planning to say since the Dakota border. "We should discuss terms." Ransom set down his cup. "Terms? I have come 3,000 miles to marry a man I have never met. This is a business arrangement. I would prefer we treat it like one and discuss it like adults." She looked at each of them in turn. Asa, eager. Eli, still. Ransom, unreadable. "I will keep your house. I will cook. I will help with the ranch, and I will help well because I do nothing by halves. In exchange, I want 3 things." "Name them," Ransom said. "A room of my own, until such time, if any, as we are properly married. A bookshelf, because I have brought 12 books, and I will not keep them in a crate like a criminal. And the right to say no to anything without explanation." The fire popped. Asa was looking at his oldest brother with naked hope. Eli was looking at Della with that flat, assessing weather gaze. And Ransom Calder sat very still for a moment, and then he said the thing that changed everything, though she did not know it yet. "You can have the room and the shelf," he said. "The right to say no was always yours. It does not need my permission to exist." Della went still. She had expected an argument. She had braced for one. She had a whole list of counter-arguments folded up next to the return ticket in her glove ready to be deployed, because in her experience men did not simply hand a woman her own freedom and call it hers by right. Men granted things. Men allowed. Men permitted and made you grateful for the permitting. This man had just told her that her freedom was not his to grant. That, she said slowly, was the correct answer. "I know," said Ransom Calder, and it was Asa told her later, grinning the most words his brother had spoken in a single evening in 3 years. "So, you would think that would be the end of the strangeness. A good answer, a fair arrangement. 3 brothers and a capable woman and a hard winter coming, and a marriage to be sorted out in its own slow time. You would think the worst of it was over. It was not even close to beginning, because that night after they had given her the small back room with its narrow bed after she had unpacked her 12 books and stacked them on the floor, since there was as yet no shelf after she had set the violin case in the corner and not opened it. Della could not sleep. The cabin was too quiet. The mountains pressed in on it, and her mind, which never rested, kept circling back to 3 small wrong things the way a tongue circles back to a sore tooth. "We have been hoping." Because Asa had not finished. And the way all 3 of them, when she had asked at supper how their parents had come to settle, this valley had gone very quiet, and Eli had said only, "Our father passed last winter," and changed the subject so fast it left a mark. She got up. She was not snooping. She told herself she was not snooping. She wanted water, and the bucket was by the hearth. And if her path to the bucket happened to take her past the rough plank desk in the corner where Asa kept his law books and his papers, well, a woman could not help where the water bucket was kept. There was a letter on the desk, half-written, or half-read, she could not tell, and she should have walked past it. She knew she should have walked past it, but her own name was on it. The agency's name. The Chicago address she knew so well. And a person cannot see their own name on a stranger's desk in a strange house in the dark and simply walk past. She picked it up. She held it to the banked red light of the hearth. And the first thing she understood, the very first thing before she understood anything else, was that the handwriting was wrong. This was the letter to the agency, the one that had described the kind of woman wanted: healthy, between 20 and 30, able to keep a homestead, preferably literate, and the one that she now saw specifically and strangely requested: a woman who could read and write well, and who had, the letter said, a steady mind and no fear of figures. She had assumed Ransom wrote it. Ransom had not written it. The hand was younger, faster, the letters of a man who had taught himself to write beautifully, out of books. It was Asa's hand. She had seen it that very evening on the flyleaf of the book in his belt. Asa had ordered her. The 24-year-old had written away for his 35-year-old brother's wife, and he had asked specifically in writing for a woman who could read and reckon. Why? Why would the youngest brother order a wife for the oldest? Why would the specification not be, can she cook, is she strong, will she bear children, the things a frontier marriage actually turned on? Why would it be, can she read? Can she handle figures? Has she a steady mind and no fear of what? The letter did not say, but Della stood there in the dark with that page trembling slightly in her hand, not from cold, and she felt the whole shape of her situation shift under her like ice on a spring creek. She had come here believing herself a wife. A transaction, yes, but an honest one. A woman traded for a life. She was beginning to suspect she had been ordered for another reason entirely. And that was when she heard the voices. They came from the barn. Low, 2 men. She set the letter down exactly where she had found it, exactly because she was careful. And she went to the window, and the moon was up over the snow line, and the barn door stood open, a hand's width with lamplight leaking out, and she could hear them, Eli and Asa, arguing in the hard whispers of men who do not want to be heard. She could not catch all of it. The wind took some. But she caught enough. She caught Eli's voice, low and flat and certain, saying, "She is too sharp. You saw her at that table. She misses nothing." And Asa pleading, "That is the whole point. That is exactly what Pa wanted. He said find someone who could see what we cannot. Pa is dead." A long pause. The wind. Then Eli again, and there was something in his voice now, something that was almost fear in a man. She would have sworn an hour ago, did not know how to be afraid. And if she finds it, Asa. If she goes looking and she finds it. We do not just lose the land. We hang, all 3 of us. You understand that? We hang. Silence in the barn. Silence in the cabin. And Adelheid. Brant stood frozen at the dark window, with her heart going hard against her ribs. 12 books stacked on the floor of a room she had been in for one single evening, and she understood finally completely that whatever she had been ordered to find, these men were terrified she would actually find it. If she finds it, we hang. She had a return ticket folded in her glove. The train came back through on the morning of the 16th. She had until morning to decide. Stay. With 3 men, one of them honest enough to break her heart, and all 3 of them sitting on a secret that ended at the end of a rope. Or run. Take the ticket and the violin and leave the suitcases if she had to, and be on that platform before the brothers woke, and go back to Chicago, to nothing, to the boarding house and the needle, and the rest of her life as someone else's picture. She did not sleep at all that night, but she did not pack either. Now I have to tell you about the next morning, because the next morning is when Della made her choice, and it was not the choice the brothers expected, and it was not the choice you would expect, and to understand it, you have to understand one more thing about her. The thing the agency letter could not have known, and Asa could only have hoped for. Adelheid Brandt had buried her mother at 19. She had buried her father at 23. She had crossed an ocean alone and a continent alone and had learned in the hardest school. There is that fear is a liar and that the only thing worse than a dangerous truth is a comfortable lie. She had spent 6 years in a Chicago boarding house, being safe, being small, being nothing, and it had nearly killed something in her that the fever and the crossing and the loneliness all together had not managed to kill. A secret that could hang 3 men was a terrible thing, but it was not nothing, and Della was so very tired of nothing. So in the morning she came out and she made breakfast and she watched Asa not quite meet her eyes and Eli watch her hands and Ransom eat with that careful reverence, and when the meal was done, she set down the coffee pot and she said in her plain, flat way, the second thing that changed everything. "The train comes through this morning," she said, "going back east." The brothers went still, all 3. "I am not going to be on it." Asa's breath went out of him. Relief naked and young. Eli's jaw tightened, and his weather gaze sharpened on her because Eli understood. Eli always understood that a woman does not announce she is staying unless she wants you to know she considered leaving, and a woman does not want you to know she considered leaving unless she has a reason of her own. Now a reason that is hers and not yours. But it was Ransom she watched. Ransom set down his cup, and he looked at her, really looked the way he had on the platform, and for one moment, the careful, guarded thing in his face cracked open, and she saw underneath it something so lonely and so braced for disappointment that it stopped the breath in her throat. "Why?" he said, "just that. Why?" And Della Brandt, who had heard through a barn wall that staying might cost her everything, looked Ransom Calder dead in his gray eyes and gave him the truest answer she had. "Because I have spent my whole life," she said, "being what people ordered me to be. And I would rather find out what you are all so afraid of than die safe and small in a city that never wanted me either." Nobody spoke. The fire popped, and outside, far off and faint, came the long, mournful cry of the morning train pulling away east without her taking her old life with it down the iron rail toward the painted edge of the world. That afternoon Ransom built her the bookshelf. She had not asked again. She had asked once the first night, and once was apparently enough, because she came in from gathering eggs and found him at the side of the cabin with a plane and a stack of pine and shavings curling gold around his boots, and a thing taking shape under his big scarred hands that did not need to be as fine as he was making it. 3 shelves, then a 4th, because she had said 12 books, and he was a man who left room. And along the top edge, where no shelf needs it, where it served no purpose, under heaven except beauty, he was carving a thin running line of leaves. She stood and watched him a while. He knew she was there. He did not stop. "You stacked your wood wrong," she said finally, because it was easier than the other thing rising in her chest. "The bottom logs will rot before spring. Air has to move through it." His hands paused on the plane. "I know," he said. "Then why?" A long silence. A curl of pine. "Pa stacked it," Ransom said. "That way. Every year." He did not look up. Have not had the heart to change it. And there it was again. The father, dead last winter, sitting under everything in this house like a stone under snow. The wood stacked wrong because a grieving son could not bear to unstack his dead father's hands. And Della stood there with her egg basket. and understood that whatever the secret was, whatever could hang these three men, it was tangled up so tight with their grief that she could not pull one thread without pulling the other. She did not say anything else. She went inside, and that night, for the first time, she opened the violin case. She had not played since Chicago. She had not played since her father's funeral, where she had played his favorite hymn so badly, through her tears, that she had vowed never to humiliate the instrument again. But there was a fire and a fierce, strange feeling in her chest that had no other way out, and three men who needed, she was beginning to think, something none of them could name. So she tucked the violin under her chin, and she played, not the hymn, something older, wilder, a thing from the old country that her mother used to hum at the washtub. It filled the small cabin and pushed back the dark and the cold and the pressing weight of the mountains, and when she finished and lowered the bow, she found all three brothers had gone silent and still. Asa had tears on his face and did not bother to hide them. Eli had turned away toward the fire, his shoulders rigid, and Ransom Calder was looking at her with that cracked open, lonely face, the one he kept hidden, and he said very low, the most personal thing anyone had said to her in years. "My mother played," he said, "before she died. We have not heard music in this house since." The bookshelf was finished the next day. She filled it with her 12 books, and she set the carved leaves running along the top, where the firelight could catch them. And it was by the standards of that hard place and that hard winter. An act of wild and reckless extravagance, and she understood it for the love letter. It was, even if the man who built it would have walked into the creek before he called it that. So that is where things stood as October came on hard, and the first snow dusted the high peaks. A woman who had been ordered for reasons she did not yet understand. Three brothers sitting on a secret that ended at a rope. A dead father whose grief was wrapped around the truth like roots around a stone. And underneath all of it, warming so slowly that neither of them would have admitted it under torture. A thing growing between the silent oldest brother and the sharp German woman who had decided to be nothing. He ordered, and was instead becoming something none of them had planned for. But I told you at the start that this woman would end up on her knees in the snow, beside a fresh grave, with a rifle at her back, pointed at the road. We are not there yet. We have a long way to ride before we are there. Because the secret these brothers were guarding was bigger than the land and older than their father's grave. And it was tangled up with the most powerful man in Yellowstone County. A man who wore a fine coat and a kind smile and held the paper on half the valley, a man named Thaddeus Coyle. And in 11 days, Mayor Thaddeus Coyle was going to ride out to the Calder homestead in his fine coat with his fine smile and his papers. And Della Brandt was going to open the door. And the first lie of many was going to walk straight into her kitchen, sit down at her table, and ask very politely for a cup of coffee. What was the moment you first knew the brothers were hiding something? Was it the unfinished sentence? Was it the wood stacked wrong? Stay with me. Because the man who walks through that door is not at all what he seems, and neither, it turns out, is the woman opening it. 11 days later, the most powerful man in Yellowstone County rode into the Calder yard on a black horse with silver on the bridle. Della saw him from the window. She was kneading bread flour to the wrists, and she watched him come down the long rise, the way Ransom had come down at the day she arrived, except this man did not look like a thing that belonged to the land. He looked like a thing that owned it. Fine gray coat, a hat that had never seen real weather, a smile she could read from 40 yards out, which is a bad sign in a man when you can read his smile before you can see his eyes. Behind her, the cabin went wrong all at once. She felt it more than saw it. Asa stopped reading. Eli stood up from where he had been mending tack and put his back to the wall by the door. That wary habit of his and his hand drifted toward nothing in particular, which meant it was drifting toward where a gun would be. And Ransom. Ransom came in from the back, with snow still on his shoulders, took one look out the window, and his whole face closed like a door slamming. "Coyle," he said. Just the name. The way you would say a thing you had stepped in. "Friend of yours," Della said. Not really a question. No. He is smiling like a friend. "That," said Eli from the wall low, "is exactly the problem." So she wiped the flour from her hands. And she did the thing none of them told her to do. The thing that was, she would think later, the first real move she made in a game she did not yet know she was playing. She put the kettle on. Because a woman who answers the door with bread on her hands and coffee already going is a woman who is not afraid. And Della had decided somewhere in those 11 days of stacked silences and unfinished sentences that whatever was coming, it would not find her afraid. The knock came. Polite. 3 taps. She opened the door, and Mayor Thaddeus Coyle took off his fine hat and gave her the full warmth of that readable smile and said, "Well, the famous bride. The whole county has been talking." "Has it?" Della stepped back to let him in because you cannot read a man on a porch. "Then the whole county has very little to talk about. Coffee, Mr. Coyle. You have ridden a long way to look at a woman making bread." Something flickered behind the smile. She caught it. It was the flicker of a man who had come expecting a frightened immigrant girl and had gotten instead a tall German woman with flour on her wrists and ice in her voice, and did not quite know what to do with the difference. "Good," she thought. "Be off your footing. Stay there." He sat at her table. The 3 brothers arranged themselves around the room without seeming to. Ransom by the hearth, Eli by the door, Asa near his law books, and Della saw the boy's hand rest very lightly on the cover of one, the way you rest a hand on a Bible. Coyle set a leather folio on the table. He did not open it. He just set it down where everyone could see it the way a man lays a pistol on a table without drawing it. And he folded his hands and he smiled at Ransom. "I will not waste the lady's mourning," he said. "The note comes due in the spring, Ransom. April, $1,140 with the interest." He said the number gently, almost kindly, which was worse. "I have carried this family a long time. Out of respect for your father. God rest him. But spring is spring and a man has to settle his books." Della poured the coffee. She set the cup in front of Coyle with a steady hand, and she watched the brothers while she did it. Ransom stone, Eli coiled, and Asa. Asa had gone white. $1,140 by April. Out here, where a whole hard year of work might clear a quarter of that. It was not a debt. It was a noose with a date on it. "That is a great deal of money," Della said pleasantly, sitting down across from the mayor as if she had every right, which she had decided she did. "For a man to carry. Out of respect." Coyle's eyes came to her, measuring now, the smile holding, but the eyes working. "Your wife has opinions," he said to Ransom. "She is not my wife yet," Ransom said. "And yes, she does. I find," said Della, "that respect which comes with an invoice attached was never respect at all. But I am new here. Perhaps things are different in Montana." The room held its breath, and Thaddeus Coyle laughed. A real laugh surprised out of him, and for 1 second, she saw the man under the mayor. And the man under the mayor was worse than the mayor, because the man under the mayor had enjoyed that, had enjoyed being matched the way a cat enjoys a mouse that runs in an interesting direction. He stood. He took up his hat. He left the coffee untouched, which told her he had never come for coffee. At the door, he paused. He looked at the room, the four of them, the fire, the bookshelf with its carved leaves, and then he looked at Della, and the smile thinned down to something almost honest, and he said the thing she would turn over in her mind for many cold nights after. "Your father," he said to the brothers, though he was looking at her, "was a stubborn man, right up to the end. A beat. Stubborn men fall downstairs." And he left. Black horse, silver bridle, gone up the rise into the white morning. Nobody moved in the cabin for a long moment. Then Della set down the coffee pot very carefully and turned to the three brothers and said the thing that broke it all open. "Your father," she said, "did not fall down any stairs, did he?" Asa looked at the floor. Eli looked at her with murder and fear fighting in his face, and Ransom Calder closed his eyes just for a second, like a man taking a blow he had known was coming for 11 days, and said, no, he did not. So that was how Della learned the first true thing, not the whole thing. They would not give her the whole thing, not yet. But that night after Coyle's visit with the wind-up and the fire low, Asa was the one who finally talked, because Asa was young, and the not telling was eating him alive, and Eli let him, because even Eli could see the dam had cracked, and there was no use pretending the water was not coming. Pa was found at the bottom of the loft stairs in the big barn, Asa said. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. Last December. Neck broken. Sheriff Pruitt rode out. Looked for about as long as it takes to roll a cigarette and ruled it an accident. Said the old man had been drinking. Had he? Della said. Pa had not touched liquor in 15 years. Asa looked up at her then, and his eyes were wet and furious. Not since our mother died. He blamed the drink for things he did. He never touched it again. 15 years. And Pruitt writes drunken fall in his book like it was nothing, and Coyle nods along, and that is that. Accident. Bury him. Move along. But he did not fall, Della said. No. How do you know? And there it was. The question. The thing Eli had been afraid of through the barn wall on her first night. She watched the brothers exchange a look, the fast, wordless look of people deciding in real time how much of their own death to hand a stranger. It was Ransom who answered. "Because he sent us a letter," Ransom said, 3 days before he died. I got up. He went to the mantel, and from behind a loose stone, a stone Della had walked past 100 times in 11 days and never once suspected, he drew out a single folded page, soft and creased from being read and read and read. He did not give it to her. He held it, like it cost something to hold. He had gone to Billings, Ransom said, to the land office, to look at something that had been bothering him, and he wrote us this. And then 3 days later, he was dead at the bottom of the stairs, and the man who runs the land office and the bank and the sheriff and half the county is the same man who just sat at your table and drank none of your coffee and told you stubborn men fall downstairs. The fire cracked. What does the letter say? Della asked. And Ransom finally crossed the room and put it in her hands. It was short. The hand was old and careful. An immigrant's hand like her father's. The hand of a man who had learned his letters late and treasured them. and it said in part that he had found something at the land office that was not right, that the deeds did not match, that families he knew, the Hendersons, the widow Tarbell, the Pole brothers, had all lost their claims in the last 2 years to clerical errors and back taxes that did not add up, that he believed Coyle was forging the federal land seals and stealing claims through the office he controlled, and that he was going to need proof, real proof, paper proof, before he went to the territorial marshal, because no one in this county would touch Thaddeus Coyle on a dead man's word alone. And then the last line. The last line was why Asa had ordered her. "I am no scholar," the old man had written. "These papers and figures swim before me. If anything happens to me before I see this through, find someone who can read what I cannot. A clear mind, a steady hand, someone with no fear of numbers and no debt to this county. They will see what we cannot." Della read it twice. Then she set it down on the table very gently, and she understood at last the whole shape of why she was here. Not a wife, or not only a wife, a clear mind, a steady hand, someone with no fear of numbers and no debt to this county. Asa had read his father's last letter, and Asa, who could not go to the land office himself without Coyle knowing, who could not hire a lawyer. Coyle did not own, who was 24 and grieving and out of options, had done the only thing he could think of. He had written to a matrimonial agency 3,000 miles away and ordered the woman his father described. "You did not order a wife for your brother," Della said softly, looking at Asa. "You ordered the someone your father asked for, and you let me believe." "I am sorry," Asa whispered. "And ransom." She turned to him. The hurt was real now, surfacing under the ice, because a woman can decide to be nothing. A man ordered and still be wounded to learn she was ordered as a tool and not a bride. "You knew, from the platform, you knew what I had really been brought here to be." "I knew," Ransom said. "And you said nothing. What was I going to say?" His voice was rough, lower than she had ever heard it. "Welcome to Montana. My dead father needs you to solve his murder. Marry me, or do not, but either way, please read these ledgers, before the man who killed him kills us." There was no way to say it, so I said nothing, and I let you make bread and stack my wood and fill the shelf with your books, and I told myself I would find the words. He looked at her, stricken. "I am not good with words, you have seen that. I built you a shelf because I could not say the thing the shelf was for, and there it was, the whole of him, laid open on the table next to his dead father's letter. A man who could not lie and could not speak, who said everything in pine and carved leaves because the words would not come. And Della stood there with her wounded heart and her clear mind and her steady hands, and felt the anger drain out of her like water through stacked wood, because air had finally gotten in and she understood him now all the way down. She picked up the letter again. "Where," she said, "are the ledgers?" Eli stiffened. "Della, you heard your father. A clear mind, a steady hand. No fear of numbers." She folded the letter and held it out to Ransom, and her voice was iron. Now the boarding house gone out of it, and something older and harder come in. "Well, here I am. You ordered exactly what you needed, and what you needed has decided to stay, and I will tell all three of you right now that I did not cross an ocean and a continent and bury both my parents to watch a man in a fine coat hang the only people in this country who have treated me like a person and not a picture." She set the letter on the mantel, behind the stone. where it lived. "Show me the books. I will read what your father could not." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Eli, the watchful one, the coiled one, the one who had said through the barn wall that she would get them all hanged, pushed off the wall and crossed the room and crouched at the hearth. And he pried up a flat stone in the floor itself. A different stone set into the foundation where the hearthstones met the dirt, and from the cold, dark hollow beneath it, he lifted out a leather-bound ledger, wrapped in oilcloth. He held it the way Ransom had held the letter. "Pa got this from the land office the week before he died," Eli said. "I do not know how. I think he copied it by hand nights in the office, when he did some bookkeeping there for extra money. Coyle trusted him. That was Coyle's mistake." He looked up at her, and the fear was still there, but under it now was something else, something that might one day with work become trust. "We cannot read it. Not really. The figures move when we look at them. Asa gets the words, but not the numbers. I get neither." A breath. "Pa was right. We needed someone like you. He stopped, started again. "I just did not want it to be true. Because the day you can read it is the day this all becomes real, and real gets people killed." Della took the ledger. It was heavier than it looked. They always are. She sat down at the table, and she opened it under the lamp, and she began to read. And the brothers watched the German woman bend over the dead man's book in the gold lamplight, her clear mind turning the pages. Her father had begged her to turn, and not one of them said a word because they all understood the way you understand, a change in the weather, that nothing in that cabin would ever be the same again. What Della found in the ledger took her 4 nights to be sure of. She was careful. She was always careful. She did not announce a thing until she could prove a thing, and so for 4 nights she sat up after the brothers slept with the lamp turned low, and her father's old habit of double-checking every column, and she traced Thaddeus Coyle's theft through the cramped copied figures, the way you trace a river to its source. And on the 4th night, she understood all of it. It was beautiful. In the way that evil is sometimes beautiful, when it is done with real skill. Coyle controlled the land office. When a homesteader fell behind, even a little, even by $1, Coyle's clerk would record a default. Then Coyle would file a federal patent on the abandoned claim, except the claim was not abandoned. The family was still living on it, and the patent bore a federal land seal that Coyle had no authority to use. He was forging the seal. That was the whole crime right there. The thing the old man had died for finding. A territorial mayor cannot issue federal land patents. Only the General Land Office can. And Coyle had been pressing forged federal seals onto stolen claims for 2 years, building a paper empire out of other families. Ruin the Hendersons, the widow. Tarbell, the Pohl brothers, name after name in the ledger. Each one a household put out on the road so a man in a fine coat could add their acres to his own. The Calders were next. That was what the note coming due in April truly was. Not a debt. A door. The moment they defaulted, Coyle would paper their land the same way with the same forged seal, and there would be nothing to fight it with because the man who kept the records was the man stealing the land. Except the old man had copied the ledger, and the ledger, in Coyle's own clerk's hand, listed the patent numbers and the dates, and a federal patent number is a federal thing, a thing that can be checked against the real records in Washington, a thing that proves a forgery. The instant a federal judge holds the forged seal next to a real one. Della sat back from the lamp. Her hands were cold. Her heart was not calm. But her mind was very, very clear. The way it got the clearest it had been since Chicago. She had it. She had the thing the old man had died for. The thing that could hang Thaddeus Coyle. And the thing that could just as easily hang the three men sleeping in the next room, if it fell the wrong way, because possessing a copied government ledger and accusing the most powerful man in the county was not a safe thing to be holding in a cabin 11 miles from anyone. She closed the book. She wrapped it in its oilcloth, and she did not put it back under the hearthstone. She carried it instead into her own small room, and she did a thing she told no one, a thing that was going to matter more than anything else in this whole long story, though she could not have known it then. She lifted the lid of her violin case. She loosened the green felt lining at the bottom, the lining that had always seemed now that she thought of it a little thicker than it needed to be, a little oddly stitched. She meant only to hide the ledger there, but when she lifted the felt, there was already something underneath it. A second folded paper, old, sealed, tucked into the false bottom of her own violin case. The case had been her mother's. She had carried it 3,000 miles, and she had thought she knew every inch of it, and she had been wrong. She stared at it. She did not understand. A paper she had never seen, sealed with wax. Old wax, the kind that had set hard a long time ago. She reached for it, and outside her door, the floorboard creaked. She froze, hand in the violin case ledger, on the bed, heart slamming. And a soft knock came, and Ransom's low voice careful, as always. "Della, there is a light under your door. It is late." She closed the case. Fast, both papers inside the ledger, and the mystery the felt smoothed back down over the secret she had not even read yet. "I could not sleep," she said through the door, and it was even true. A pause. "The reading," he said. It was not a question. He knew. Of course he knew. "You have found something." She opened the door. He stood there in the dark hallway with no lamp, just the shape of him, big and still and worried, and she looked up into his face and made a decision. The decision to give him the truth, because she had learned in 11 days that this was a man you could not lie to, and should not a man who answered honesty with honesty and grief with grief. "I have found enough," she said quietly, "to hang Thaddeus Coyle, and enough to hang the three of you if any of it slips. The ledger your father copied is real Ransom. It is everything, patent numbers, forged seals, 2 years of stolen claims. Your father did not die drunk, and he did not die by accident. He died because he found exactly this, and he was 3 days from being able to prove it." She watched the words land on him, watched a year of grief and rage and helplessness finally find a target. He was right about all of it. He just needed someone to read it, and now someone has. Ransom Calder stood very still in the dark, and then he did a thing he had not done in front of her. A thing she suspected he had not done in front of anyone since they put his father in the ground. His shoulders, those broad stone shoulders, came down, and his head bowed. And this enormous silent man who built shelves because he could not speak, put one scarred hand flat against the door frame to hold himself up, and wept without sound. The way the strongest people weep, the way you weep when someone finally, after a long cold year, tells you that you were not crazy, that the thing you knew in your bones was true, that your father was murdered, and it was not your fault, and here at last is the proof. She did not touch him. She wanted to. She was surprised by how much she wanted to. But she had asked that first night for the right to say no without explanation. and she understood without being told that this man needed the same right, the right to fall apart and put himself back together without a witness reaching in. So she stood with him in the dark, close, not touching, close enough to feel the warmth of him through the cold cabin air. And when he had himself again, he straightened, and he wiped his face with the back of his hand, unashamed, and he looked at her with something in his gray eyes that had not been there before the beginning of the thing she had been refusing to name since the platform. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, but the way he said them. "Do not thank me yet," Della said. "We have proof. We do not have a way to use it. The marshal is in Helena. The judge rides circuit, and will not come through until spring. Coyle owns the sheriff and the land office and the bank, and the moment he suspects we have this ledger, he will do to us exactly what he did to your father and dress it up as an accident, and Sheriff Pruitt will write it in his book and roll a cigarette. Then we wait for spring," Ransom said. "Then we survive until spring," Della corrected. "Which is not the same thing. Coyle is coming for this land in April, whether he knows about the ledger or not. We have to keep 3 men and 1 ledger alive through a Montana winter with the most powerful man in the county wanting all of it gone." She almost smiled. It was not a happy smile. "I have handled worse." "Have you?" "No," she admitted, but it seemed the thing to say. And Ransom called her in the dark hallway of a cabin under the crazy mountains with his dead father's murder finally proven and a noose hanging over the spring loft, low and rough and surprised. This was the opposite of Coyle's laugh. This was warm. This was a man laughing because for the first time in a year he was not alone with the thing he carried. That sound, she thought. I could ruin my whole life chasing that sound. The thought frightened her so badly. She said good night and shut the door. The weeks that followed were the strangest, and though she would not have admitted it, the happiest of her life. Because, here is the thing nobody tells you about danger. Danger and joy live very close together. A house with a secret and a deadline is a house where every ordinary thing matters more, where every meal might be one of the last easy ones, where a woman learns to ride a horse, not as a pastime, but as a necessity always in case, and falls off twice, and gets back on twice without a word, while a silent man looks away to hide a smile. He has no right to be smiling given the circumstances. She learned to ride. She learned to shoot because Eli insisted, grim and patient, teaching her to load and aim a rifle in the cold gray mornings, and she was bad at it, and then less bad at it, and then one frozen dawn, she put 3 rounds in a row through a tin can at 40 paces, and Eli looked at her for a long moment and said, "Huh," which from Eli was practically a parade. She learned the land, the creek that froze from the edges in, the ridge where Coyle's riders sometimes sat their horses watching, just watching 2 black shapes against the white that would turn and go when Ransom rode out toward them. The way weather came down off the peaks with no warning, so that a clear morning could be a killing whiteout by noon. And she watched the brothers, and the brothers changed around her. Asa bloomed. The guilt of the lie had been crushing him, and once it was out, once she had stayed, knowing everything, he became the boy. He should have been bright and funny and forever asking her to explain a point of Latin or argue some piece of law. He was puzzling through his future. He confided was to be a lawyer, a real one, and put men like Coyle behind bars with paper instead of guns. She helped him study. The law books and the violin shared the lamplight now. Eli thawed, slowly, like the creek. He never said much, and he never stopped watching the ridge, but the watching of her hands turned into something else, a kind of careful respect, a man recalibrating everything he had believed about the danger she represented. He carried, she could see a weight of his own separate from the others, something behind his wary eyes that he had not told her and maybe had not told anyone. She did not press. She was good at not pressing. But she set it aside in that careful catalogue of hers because the thing Eli was not saying had a particular flavor she had learned to recognize. It was the flavor of a man who was afraid he was guilty of something. In the third week of October, the fever came. It came the way fevers come on the frontier, fast and from nowhere. A chill at supper and shaking by midnight, and by morning Della was burning in the narrow bed with the room swimming and her own mother's face floating up out of the heat, calling her home in German. The nearest doctor was in Miles City, 90 miles, a week's ride in good weather, and the weather was already turning. So Ransom did not send for a doctor. He nursed her himself. She remembered it only in pieces, the way you remember a fever, in bright fragments with dark between them. She remembered the cool cloth on her forehead changed and changed again. She remembered broth held to her lips, one careful spoon at a time. She remembered most of all the voice, low, halting, reading to her in the dark from one of her own 12 books, a book of Tennyson, the English coming slow and rough off a tongue that had learned it late, the big silent man working through verse that was hard for anyone, harder for him because she had a fever and could not sleep, and it was the only thing he could think of to give her. On the fourth night the fever broke. She woke in the gray before dawn, weak and clear and soaked through, and she turned her head on the pillow, and she saw him. Ransom was asleep in the chair beside her bed, a book open on his chest, fallen there when sleep took him mid-sentence. And his big scarred hand rested on the edge of her blanket. Not on her, just near, close enough that if she shifted the back of her hand would find his, close enough to feel the warmth of him through the wool. He had sat there 4 nights. She did not wake him. She lay still and looked at his face in the last of the firelight. The hard jaw gone soft in sleep, the lines of a year of grief eased for once, and she thought a thought she had been holding off with both hands since the platform. I came here expecting a transaction, she thought. I found a person. And then quieter underneath the thought that frightened her worse, I found my person. She closed her eyes before he woke, because she was not ready, because a woman who has buried everyone she ever loved learns to be careful with the loving learns. It goes wrong, learns it always goes wrong. And there was a man in a fine coat 11 miles away who hung the people she was starting to love. Stop it, she told herself. Stop it. You have work to do. Except she did not stop it, because you cannot. When she was well enough to be up, she found Ransom at the wood pile. I was restacking it. All of it. The whole winter's wood pulled down and built up again, and she stood in the cabin doorway with a blanket around her shoulders and watched him do it, and she understood what she was seeing before he said a word. He had unstacked his dead father's pattern. He was stacking it her way. Air through it, so it would not rot from the bottom. She came out into the cold and stood beside him, both of them looking at the wood. You changed it, she said. You were right, he said, about the air. A long pause, a breath of white in the cold. And he is gone. And I cannot keep building everything the way a dead man built it, or I will rot from the bottom too. It was the most he had ever said about his grief. She reached out after a moment, and she put her hand on the back of his hand where it rested on the top log the first time she had touched him on purpose, and she felt him go, Still, felt the catch in his breath, felt the warmth of his scarred, working hand under her cold one. Neither of them looked at the other. They looked at the wood. But something passed between them, in the gray morning, that did not need words, which was good, because words were not his gift and were becoming, she was finding, less and less necessary. She took her hand back. She went inside. But her heart was loud the whole rest of that day, so that was the autumn. Joy and danger braided together so tight she could not pull one thread without the other. A woman learning to shoot and falling in love and reading a dead man's ledger by lamplight. 3 brothers thawing toward her one frozen morning at a time. And always on the ridge, 2 black shapes against the snow, watching, waiting for spring. And then, in the 2nd week of December, on the coldest night of the year so far, 2 things happened at once. The first was that Della finally read the sealed paper from the bottom of her violin case. The second was that Coyle's men came in the dark to burn the barn. She had put off the violin case. She knew that was strange. She had a mystery sealed in wax in her own luggage, and she had left it sitting there for weeks. And if you had asked her why, she would not have been able to tell you. Except that some part of her, some careful, frightened part, suspected that whatever was in that paper would change things again, would shift the ice under her one more time, and she was not ready. She was happy, God help her. She was happy, and she did not want it to change. But that night she could not sleep, and the case was right there. And a person can only leave their own mother's violin case sealed against them for so long. So she lifted the felt. She took out the paper. She broke the old seal, the wax crumbling away, and she unfolded it under the lamp, and she began to read, and the cold that went through her had nothing to do with December, because it was a letter to her, or not to her exactly, to whatever woman the agency would send. From a man she had never met, more than a year ago, before her father even died, before she had ever heard the name Calder or Coyle, or thought of going west. And it began in the same careful, late-learned immigrant hand. She had read off the mantle a dozen times. It began, "To the woman who reads this, I am sorry. By the time this reaches you, I will likely be dead." It was from the brother's father. The old man had not only described the woman he needed in his last letter to his sons. He had reached out to himself more than a year before he died through the very agency Isa would later use, and he had arranged something paid for. So asked the agency to slip a sealed paper into the lining of whatever case the chosen woman carried, because he had known somehow even then that he was a dead man walking, and that his sons would need more than he could give them while he breathed. And Della sat there with the letter shaking in her hands and got exactly as far as the 2nd paragraph. She got as far as the words, "There is one more thing you must know about my sons, one thing I have never told even them, a thing that changes who has the right to this land." And that was when she smelled the smoke. And that was when Eli started screaming in the yard that the barn was on fire. The barn was a tower of fire against the black December sky. Della came out of their cabin with the old man's half-read letter still in her fist, and the cold hitting her like a wall, and the whole world gone orange and roaring. 40 feet of dry timber and winter hay going up like a struck match, sparks climbing into the dark, and the horses screaming inside. That sound a horse makes, she would hear it the rest of her life. Eli was already at the barn doors, hauling them open. Asa was running with buckets toward a creek that was frozen solid, and Ransom was going into the fire. Ransom! She did not remember screaming it. Ransom! No. He did not stop. Of course he did not stop. He pulled his coat over his head and he went through the burning doorway into the smoke, After the horses, and Della stood frozen for 1/2 second with the letter in her hand, the secret, the thing the old man had died to hide. And then she did the only thing a clear mind could do. She put the letter in her teeth, and she ran toward the fire. Because the horses were everything. A homestead with no horses in December was a homestead of dead people. No way to town. No way to haul hay. No way to run when Coil came in the spring. The horses were not livestock. They were the difference between living until April and not. So she ran to where Eli was fighting a panicked mare at the door, and she grabbed the halter on the far side, and the mare reared, and her hooves came down, where Della's head had been a breath before, and Eli shouted something lost in the roar, and together they dragged the screaming animal out into the snow, then back for the next one. Ransom came out of the smoke, leading 2 horses, blind with terror, his coat smoking his face, black, and he handed them off and turned and went back in, and Della grabbed his arm. "There is one more." His voice was wrecked. "The gelding, back stall, Ransom. One more." And he was gone again into the orange dark. The roof was starting to go. She could hear it. That deep cracking groan of a thing about to come down, and Asa was screaming his brother's name from the bucket line, and Eli had 3 horses by their halters dancing in the snow, and could not let go, and the barn was dying around the man she loved. There it is, she thought. There is the thought I would not let myself think. I love him, and he is in a building that is about to fall on him. She did not go in after him. She wanted to. Every cell in her wanted to. But she was not a fool, and a second body in a collapsing barn is not a rescue, it is 2 funerals. And so she stood at the doorway with the heat blistering her face, and she did the only useful thing left. She called him, not screaming. Screaming gets lost. She put her whole chest into it, low and hard, the way you call across a field, the way her father had called the cows a sound. A panicked man could follow when he could not see. Ransom called her, steady, cutting through the roar. "This way, my voice. Come to my voice." And she kept calling, steady, a rope of sound thrown into the fire. And out of the smoke and the falling sparks and the dying barn came a shape bent staggering, leading a blindfolded gelding with his own smoking coat following the one steady thing in all that chaos, following her voice, and he cleared the doorway just as the roof came down behind him in a roar and a fountain of sparks that lit the whole valley white. He fell in the snow. The gelding bolted free. Eli caught it, and Della dropped to her knees beside Ransom in the snow, with the heat of the dying barn at her back, and the letter still clenched in her teeth, and her hands going all over him. His face, his shoulders, his arms checking the way you check, and he was burned, and he was choking, and he was alive. He was alive. He looked up at her, black with soot, eyes streaming, and he rasped, "Your voice. I followed your voice." "Shut up," she said, and she was crying now. Finally, the German woman who did not weep at gravesides was weeping over a living man in the snow. "Shut up, you absolute fool. You went into a fire for a horse. For 4 horses. I do not care about the horses. You said the horses were everything. You are everything." It came out of her before she could stop it. Raw, true, stupid. And she heard herself say it, and her own eyes went wide in horror. Oh no, you did not just in front of his brothers in the snow with the barn burning. You did not just say, I mean, the horses are also, strategically, Important. Ransom Calder looked up at her from the snow, and through all the soot and the pain and the ruin came the distant cousin of a smile, the rumor of one, the realest one she had ever seen. Strategically, he said. Be quiet, she said. You are everything, too, he said. And the barn burned down to a glowing skeleton behind them, and his brothers pretended very hard to be busy with the horses, and Adelheid Brandt knelt in the snow, holding the soot-black face of the man she had crossed a world to read a ledger for, and did not let go. They did not find out until morning that it had been no accident, though of course they knew. A barn does not catch fire on its own on the coldest, still night of the year with no lamp lit inside it. But it was Eli who found the proof at first light walking the burn in the gray cold, and he came back to the cabin with his face like stone and set a thing down on the table in front of all of them. A coal-oil tin. Empty. Thrown in the hayloft window, Eli said. I found the tin in the snow on the north side, and tracks. 2 riders. Shod horses, not range stock. He looked around the table at all of them. Coyle does not even bother to hide it anymore. He wants us to know. He is telling us. Spring or sooner. His choice. Asa was bandaging Ransom's burned hands at the hearth. Della was watching the empty tin. He is escalating, she said quietly, which means he is nervous. A confident man waits for April. A nervous man burns your barn in December. Something has changed. Coyle is afraid of something. Afraid of what? Asa said. And Della almost said it. Almost said afraid that your father copied his ledger. Afraid that someone in this house can finally read it. Because that was surely it. Somehow Coyle had gotten wind that the Calders were no longer helpless. But she did not say it. Because her eyes had gone in that moment to her own door, behind which sat a violin case, behind which sat a ledger that could hang Coyle and a half-read letter from a dead man that she had pulled from her teeth in the snow and not finished. That said there was one more thing. One thing the old man never told even his sons, a thing that changed who had the right to the land. She needed to finish that letter. She needed to finish it before she said one more word to anyone. So she stood and she said she was going to make coffee and dress the burns properly, and she went into her room and shut the door and lifted the felt and took out the old man's letter with her hands shaking, and she read the rest of it by cold gray morning light, while 3 brothers murmured on the other side of the wall. And what it said changed everything. The old man wrote that he had not always been a homesteader, that before Montana, before the long climb to 40 acres and a sod house grown into a cabin, he had been a younger and a worse man in the years after his first wife died, the years he blamed on the drink he never touched again. And in those years, he wrote, he had done a thing he had spent the rest of his life trying to make right. Eli was not his son, not by blood. Eli had been the child of a man the old man had wronged, a partner back in the bad years, a man whose claim the old man had jumped, whose wife had died of the hardship of it, whose infant son had been left with nothing. And the old man, when the drink left him and the shame came in, had gone back and found that orphaned boy and taken him in and raised him as his own son, and never ever told him, never told any of the 3 of them, that the child he had raised first and loved most fiercely was the living proof of the worst thing he had ever done. I jumped a man's claim, the old man wrote, and it killed his wife. And I have spent near 30 years trying to deserve the son it orphaned. Eli does not know. He must never learn carelessly that it was me who ruined his blood father, for it would break him and he has carried enough. But you must know whoever you are because of the land. Because of the land. Della read the next lines 3 times before she understood them, and when she understood them, the cold went all the way to the bottom of her. The original claim. The Calder homestead. The 40 acres that had grown to 160. The land. Coyle wanted the land. The note came due in April. It had never legally belonged to the old man at all. It had belonged to Eli's blood father, the man whose claim the old man jumped. The claim had been filed in that dead man's name decades ago and never properly transferred, because the old man could not transfer a thing he had stolen without revealing he had stolen it. So he had simply lived on it, worked it, paid what taxes he could, and let the rest blur in the loose record-keeping of a frontier county, which meant the rightful heir to the entire Calder homestead by blood and by the original filing was Eli. Eli, who did not know he was adopted. Eli, who did not know his blood father had been ruined by the man who raised him. Eli, who believed himself the middle brother of 3, and had no idea that the very ground they were fighting Coyle for was by law his and his alone. And there was worse. Because the old man's final lines explained why Coyle wanted this particular claim so badly, more than all the others, why he had killed for it. Coyle knows, the old man wrote. I do not know how, but Coyle has learned that this claim was never clean. That is why he is so certain of it. He believes that because my title is flawed, he can paper over it with no one to fight him, that a stolen claim cannot be defended by the man who stole it. He is right that my title is bad. But he does not know about Eli. He does not know there is a true heir with a true claim. A claim older than my theft and older than Coyle's forgeries, a claim that would stand up in any federal court in the land. Eli is the answer. Eli has always been the answer, but only if he can be told the truth without it destroying him. I could never find the way. Perhaps you can. You who read what I could not. Della lowered the letter. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the cold gray room, and she understood finally the full and terrible shape of what the old man had ordered when he ordered her. Not a wife, not even only a witness. He had needed someone who could read a ledger, yes, but more than that, he had needed someone strong enough and wise enough and kind enough to hold the most dangerous truth a family can hold, and to know when and how to set it down. Eli was the heir. Eli was the only one who could defeat Coyle, because Eli's blood claim was the one thing Coyle's forgeries could not paper over. And Eli was the one who must never. His dead father had begged be carelessly told. She found out Eli's own secret that same terrible day. She had meant to wait. She had meant to think, to plan, to find the careful way the old man never could. But the fire had broken something loose in all of them, and that afternoon, while Ransom slept off the smoke, and Asa rode the 4 miles to the neighbor for burn salve, Eli found Della alone at the table, with the ledger open, and he sat down across from her and he said the thing he had been carrying. I know what is in that book, Eli said. Not the figures, but what it means. Coyle's forgeries. He turned his coffee cup in his scarred hands and did not drink. I have to tell you something, before this goes any further, because if we use that ledger, if we go to a judge, it comes out. And I would rather you hear it from me than from Coyle's lawyer in a courtroom. Della went very still. 2 years ago, Eli said. Before Pa died, I worked for Coyle, in the land office, for one winter. He looked up at her, and the shame in his face was an old shame, a worn shame, a thing he had carried a long time. We needed money. The note, always the note, and Coyle offered me clerk work, copying deeds, filing papers. And I did it. And I signed things, Della. My name is on things, patents, transfers. I did not know what they were. I thought I was copying records. I was a witness on documents that I now know were forgeries. My signature is on Coyle's stolen claims. The room was very quiet. My name, Eli said, is on the crime. If that ledger goes to a federal judge, the first name that judge will find on the forged patents is mine, not Coyle's. Coyle was careful. He used clerks. He used me. A long breath. I could hang for this, and worse. If I hang the ledger that should hang, Coyle hangs me instead, and Coyle walks and uses my conviction to prove the Calders were the criminals all along. He set down the cup. So you see, the thing that saves us is the same thing that destroys me. And I have known it for weeks, and I did not tell you, because I did not want you to stop. We need that ledger to fight him, even if the cost of fighting him is me. And there it was, 2 secrets on the same table on the same day, the old man's and Eli's. Eli was the rightful heir to the land, and Eli was the one man whose signature could be used to hang the whole family, the true heir and the marked man, the same person. The single thread that pulled one way, saved them all, and pulled the other way, destroyed them all. Della looked at Eli across the table, and she made a choice, the hardest choice of the whole story, harder than staying harder than the fire. Because she was holding in that moment the knowledge that this man was adopted, that his blood father had been ruined by the man who raised him, that the land was rightfully his, that everything he believed about himself was incomplete. And the old man had begged her to find the careful way, the gentle way, the right time. This was not the right time. A man does not need to learn. He is adopted and orphaned, and an heir, all in one afternoon the day after a fire, while his brother sleeps off smoke in the next room. So she did not tell him. She held the first secret, and she dealt with the second. Your signature, she said slowly, is on documents you were told were ordinary records by an employer you trusted, who used you precisely because you would not understand what you were signing. She leaned forward, her clear mind turning the figures and the law and Asa's law books all moving together. Eli, that is not guilt. That is the oldest defense there is. A clerk who copies in good faith what his employer represents as legitimate is a witness, not a forger. The forger is the man who made the seal and directed the fraud and profited from it, not the boy who was handed a pen and told to write. Eli stared at her. You do not know that will hold, he said. No, she admitted. I am not a lawyer, but Asa is going to be one. And there is a thing your father copied into the back of this ledger that you have not seen because the numbers swim for you. She turned to the last pages, to columns the brothers had never been able to read. Your father did not just copy the forged patents, Eli. He copied the office payroll, the record of who was paid and when and for what. And it shows that you were paid a clerk's wage, for clerk's work, by the day, like a man hired to copy. It does not show you sharing in a single dollar of the stolen claims. Coyle kept all of that. Your father copied the proof that you were a hired hand and nothing more. She looked up at him. Your father was protecting you, even in the ledger, even from this. He copied the one thing that proves your innocence, and he hid it under the hearthstone, and he never told you, because telling you would have meant telling you the danger you were in. Eli put his face in his scarred hands, and the watchful man, the coiled man who never put his back to the open, sat at the table and shook, because he had carried for 2 years the certainty that he was the rot at the center of his family, the marked man whose name would hang them all, and a woman who had been in his house for 3 months had just shown him that his dead father had been quietly building his defense the whole time. He knew, Eli said into his hands. He knew, and he never said. He loved you, Della said, and she had to look away when she said it because she knew the rest. She knew exactly how much and why and at what cost the old man had loved this particular son. And she could not say that part, not yet, not for a long time yet. More than you know, Eli. He loved you more than you will ever know. That was the dark middle of the winter, the fire, the 2 secrets, the proof that saved Eli and the truth about Eli she could not yet give. And through the rest of December, as the deepest cold came down and the note came closer, they prepared. Because Della would not wait passively for spring to be slaughtered. She made a plan, and the plan was the ledger, and the plan was the law, and the plan was to survive until the circuit judge came through. Because the one thing Coyle could not own was a federal judge riding circuit from outside the territory. But surviving meant the wedding. It was Della who said it, in fact, plainly, the way she said everything. "We should marry," she told Ransom one night by the fire. "You and I." And when he looked at her stunned, she went on fast, because if she stopped, she would lose her nerve. "Not only for the reason you are thinking, though that reason is present, but because if we are married, I am family. A wife can testify. A wife has standing. A hired woman who reads ledgers can be dismissed by Coyle's lawyer as a paid liar. A wife defending her family cannot be so easily waved away. It is strategic." "Strategic," Ransom said. "Stop saying it like that. You proposed to me," he said slowly, "with the word strategic. I propose to you with 3 good reasons, and one I am not saying out loud. Say it. No. Della." And she looked at him across the fire. This enormous, silent, burned and healing man who had walked into an inferno for 4 horses and followed her voice out of it, and she felt the whole careful architecture of her reasons fall down, and she said the thing under the thing. "Because I love you," she said. There. Because somewhere between the platform and the fire, I stopped being able to imagine the rest of my life without your terrible silence and your carved leaves and your wood stacked wrong. Because you built me a shelf when you could not say a word, and I have never in my life been loved that loudly by a man so quiet. That is the reason. The others are also true. But that is the one. Ransom Calder was quiet for a long moment. I was always quiet. But this was a different quiet. This was the quiet of a man reaching for something across a great distance, something he had given up on and finding it there after all. "In the old country," he said finally, his voice rough, "my mother's country, there is a word, koselig." He looked into the fire, and then he looked at her. "It means the feeling of being warm while the world is cold, of being home when you are far from home." He swallowed. I have not felt it since she died. I did not think I would feel it again. And then a tall woman got off a train and told me my chin was better in person. A breath. This is Kosalig. You are Kosalig. The whole house is warm again, and it is you. And Della, who had crossed an ocean to be no one's picture, felt her eyes fill, because in German there was a word too, her mother's word, and it meant the very same thing. Geborgenheit, she whispered. We say Geborgenheit, to be safe, inside the warmth. She reached across the firelight and took his scarred and healing hand. I came here, expecting a cold man in a cold place, and instead I found the warmest thing I have ever known. She did not say more. She did not have to. They were married on the 6th of January, 1883, by a circuit preacher who rode through a snowstorm to reach them, because the judge would not come until spring, but a preacher could be had in winter. The ceremony was in the cabin. The witnesses were Asa weeping and grinning, and Eli, who stood up beside his brother as best man, and did not know. Would not know for some time yet that he was standing in a house that was rightfully his, beside a brother who shared none of his blood and all of his heart. And the violin played after. Della played it badly because her hands were shaking and her eyes were wet, but no one minded. And the carved leaves caught the firelight on the bookshelf, and for one night the noose and the forgeries and the dead man's secrets all seemed very far away. When the door of her little room closed that night, it closed on a marriage. Outside, the snow came down soft and steady over the valley, over the burned bones of the barn, over the ridge where no riders sat in such weather. And when morning came, gray and clean and new, Della woke in the circle of her husband's arms, a wife in every way there was, and lay still and listened to him breathe and let herself believe, just for the length of one held breath, that everything was going to be all right. It was not going to be all right. Not yet. Because winter does not last, and spring was coming, and with the spring came the circuit judge, and with the circuit judge came the reckoning the old man had died waiting for. The thaw came late that year in the last week of April, and word came with it up the muddy road from Billings that Judge Horace Whitfield had arrived to hold the spring term of the territorial court. Della had never seen him, but she had learned everything about him. She could that winter, the way she learned everything by asking careful questions of the few neighbors brave enough to visit a marked family. Whitfield was old, federal, appointed out of Washington years back and never bought, which in that territory made him very nearly a unicorn. He rode a circuit twice a year and answered to no mayor and no sheriff and no bank, and Thaddeus Coyle did not own one single thread of him, which was exactly why Coyle moved the moment the judge arrived. Because here is how a clever, wicked man thinks. Coyle could not stop the judge from coming, so instead he would use him. He filed his claim on the Calder land that very week, the forged federal patent, the note declared in default, and he filed it as a clean civil matter. A simple foreclosure, expecting it to be rubber-stamped in a morning before the old judge moved on the way. Everything in that county got rubber-stamped because who in Yellowstone County would ever stand up in open court and call Thaddeus Coyle a thief? I did not know about the ledger. He did not know about Eli's blood, and he most certainly did not know about the woman. The night before the hearing, Della did a thing that she told only Ransom. She would not leave the evidence in the cabin, not with Coyle's riders on the ridge and a hearing in the morning, not after the barn. So at dusk, with the light going purple over the snow that still lay in the hollows, she and Ransom walked out past the burned barn, to the family plot on the rise, where a single wooden marker stood over a grave gone almost a year old. The old man's grave. And there, in the half-frozen ground at the foot of her dead father-in-law's grave, with Ransom standing over her, Della knelt in the last of the snow and buried the ledger and both of the old man's letters, wrapped in oilcloth inside a tin, where no rider ransacking the cabin in the night would ever think to dig. She was not crying. She was doing arithmetic, cold exact arithmetic, counting the lies it had taken to fill that grave, counting the man still breathing in his fine house in Billings who had told the biggest one. And behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him through her wool coat, stood Ransom Calder, 6'6" in his boots, a rifle held low and easy at his side, pointed not at her, never at her, but down the long road toward town, toward the place the riders would come from if they came. They did not come that night, and in the morning, Della dug the tin back up with her own cold hands, and she unwrapped the ledger and the letters, and she did one last thing. She took the old man's 2 letters and she slid them down into the false bottom of her violin case beneath the felt in the hollow the old man had used to reach her across death and distance, and the ledger she wrapped fresh and carried under her arm. 2 kinds of proof, one for the crime, one for the claim, and she carried them both into town. Because the day Coyle filed his claim, Adelheid Brandt, Calder put on her blue traveling dress, the too fine one, the one she had arrived in, and she rode into Billings beside her husband and her brothers with a ledger wrapped in oilcloth and a violin case held tight on her lap, and she walked into Judge Whitfield's courtroom to do the thing she had crossed a world to do. The courtroom was the back of the Billings feed store, cleared of sacks, a plank floor, and a borrowed table, and 40 hard chairs, and every one of them full. Because word travels in a small county, and word had traveled that the Marked family was going to stand up against Thaddeus Coyle, and the whole valley had come to watch them fail. Coyle was already there. Fine gray coat, that readable smile. A lawyer beside him in a town suit, a folio of papers, the forged patent on top with its forged federal seal pressed into the wax, gleaming official, a perfect lie. And beside Coyle in the front row sat his wife, Mrs. Lavinia Coyle. Della had heard of her all winter and never met her, and she knew her at once the way you know a certain kind of woman, by the way she had arranged her face into pity before anyone had said a word. Lavinia Coyle had spent the winter making sure the whole county knew her version of Della Brandt, the German, the mail-order woman, the schemer who had gotten her hooks into those poor motherless Calder boys, who had married the simple oldest one for his land, who was, everyone agreed, not quite respectable. Lavinia had done her work well. Della could feel it in the room, in the way the women would not meet her eyes, in the cold little current of judgment that ran through the borrowed chairs. She let it run. She had been judged by better than Lavinia Coyle, and survived it. Judge Whitfield came in. Old, yes, white-whiskered and so moving, but his eyes when they swept the room were not slow at all, and Della felt a small hard flicker of hope, because those were not the eyes of a man who rubber-stamped things. The lawyer spoke first. It was simple, he said. A debt, a note in default, a patent properly filed. The Calder family had failed to pay, and Mr. Coyle, with great reluctance and out of long respect for the late father, was merely claiming what the law allowed. He laid the forged patent before the judge, with its gleaming seal. Whitfield looked at it a long moment. "This is a federal patent," the judge said, "issued by the General Land Office." Yes, Your Honor. A mayor does not issue these. No, Your Honor. It came through the proper office. Mr. Coyle merely holds the underlying note. And Coyle smiled his readable smile, and the room settled because it was going exactly the way everyone had known it would go. And Lavinia Coyle let the pity on her face warm, by a degree into something closer to triumph. And then Judge Whitfield said, "The defense, does the family have counsel?" And Asa Calder stood up, 24 years old, self-taught out of borrowed books by candlelight. In his one good shirt, with his voice not quite steady, the youngest brother stood up in that crowded room and said, "Your Honor, the family will speak for itself. With the court's permission, my brother's wife will present what we have found." A murmur went through the room. Coyle's lawyer half rose. "Your Honor, this is most irregular. A woman and a foreigner. At that, she has no standing in a property matter. She is not even. She is a member of the household whose property is at issue," Whitfield said mildly. "And this is my courtroom, not yours, and I will hear who I please. Sit down." He looked at Della. "Mrs. Calder, you may come forward." So Della Brandt stood up in her too fine blue dress, with the whole county watching her fail, and she walked to the front of that borrowed courtroom with a ledger under her arm and a violin case in her hand, and she did not fail. She set the ledger on the table first. "Your Honor," she said, and her voice was steady, "the boarding house gone out of it. Only the iron left. The patent before you bears a federal seal. I will show the court that the seal is forged, and that the man who forged it has been stealing the claims of this county's families for 2 years, and that he murdered the man who discovered it, the father of this family, whose grave is not yet a year old." The room went absolutely silent. Coyle's smile did not move, but his eyes did. His eyes went to the ledger, and Della saw in them, for just one instant, the thing she had been waiting all winter to see. Fear. She opened the ledger, and she walked Judge Whitfield through it, the way she had walked through it those 4 nights. By the lamp, slowly, exactly, column by column, because the truth does not need to shout, it only needs to be shown. Here were the families, the Hendersons, the widow Tarbell, the Pole brothers. Here were the defaults recorded for $1, $2 sums no honest office would foreclose on. Here were the patent numbers Coyle had filed against each one with their federal seals. And here was the thing that hanged him. "Your Honor," Della said, "these patent numbers can be checked against the real records of the General Land Office in Washington. Every federal patent has a true number on file. I have written to the Territorial Marshal in Helena with these numbers, but the court need not even wait for Washington, because there is a simpler proof, and it is sitting on your table." She pointed at the forged patent, at its gleaming seal. A true federal seal is struck from a single die held under lock in Washington. A forged one is carved by hand. Hold them to the light, Your Honor. Compare the seal on Mr. Coyle's patent to the seal on any genuine federal document in this court's own records. A carved copy can fool a glance. It cannot fool a comparison. Whitfield held the patent to the light from the window. He took from his own case a genuine federal document, and he held the 2 seals side by side, and the whole room watched an old man's face, and the whole room saw it change. "These are not struck from the same die," Judge Whitfield said quietly. "This seal is carved." Uproar. Coyle was on his feet. His lawyer was shouting about provenance, about how a ledger written in pencil by a dead drunk proved nothing about who could even say this woman had not forged the ledger herself, a clever foreign woman with a grudge. Where was her proof that any of this came from the land office at all? And it was a good attack. It was. Because he was right about one thing. A copied ledger, however damning, was a dead man's word against a living mayor, and a clever lawyer can always whisper the word forgery back at the one who cries it. This was the moment Coyle had been counting on all along, because Coyle thought the ledger was all they had. He was wrong. There is the matter. Coyle's lawyer, press sensing blood, of the signatures on these supposed forgeries. Your Honor, if the court examines the patents this woman calls stolen, the court will find them witnessed, signed, and signed, Your Honor, by a member of this very family. He wheeled and pointed at the front row, at Eli. By that man, Eli Calder. His name is on the very documents he now calls forgeries. If a crime was committed in that land office, Your Honor, there sits the criminal, and this whole performance is a guilty family trying to hang an honest mayor to save one of their own from the rope. And the room turned the way a room does, hungry to look at Eli. Eli who had gone gray. Eli who had known this was coming, who had told Della by the fire that the thing that saved them was the same thing that destroyed him. Eli, who put his hands flat on his knees and prepared. You could see it to stand up and take it to let his name be the price. But Della was already speaking. Eli Calder was a paid clerk, she said clearly, hired by the day who copied what his employer told him were lawful records. I can prove it because the dead man whose ledger you doubt copied the land office payroll as well. She turned the ledger to the last pages, the columns the brothers could never read, and she laid it before the judge. Here, Your Honor, the office wages. Eli Calder paid a clerk's daily wage for a single winter. Not $1 of the stolen claims ever came to him. He was the pen. Thaddeus Coyle was the hand. And a man who is handed a document and told to witness it commits no crime. That the man who built the lie does not own 10 times over. She looked at the judge. The father copied this to protect his son, even from beyond his own murder. I would ask the court to honor what that man died doing. Whitfield studied the payroll. He studied it a long time, and Coyle, watching the old judge's face, made his mistake. Because Thaddeus Coyle was a man who had always been the most powerful person in any room, and a man like that, when the room begins to turn against him, does not know how to be quiet. He had ruled this county for years by the certainty in his own voice. And so when he saw the judge's face hardening, he did the thing such men do. He spoke. He could not help it. This is absurd, Coyle said, and his voice had lost its kindly gentleness, now gone hard and high. That old fool went poking through records that were none of his business, and if he broke his neck for it, then he should have minded his own affairs. A man who climbs where he has no business climbing. And he stopped, because the room had gone silent in a new way, because he heard half a beat too late what had come out of his own mouth. That old fool went poking through records, if he broke his neck for it. No one had said the old man broke his neck poking through records. No one had said how he died at all in that courtroom, except Della, who had said only that he was murdered, for what he discovered. The sheriff's ruling was a drunken fall. Coyle had just told a room full of witnesses that he knew the old man had broken his neck over the records, that he knew exactly how and exactly why. A man does not know the cause of an accident he had nothing to do with. Whitfield's old eyes had gone very cold and very sharp. "Mr. Coyle," the judge said slowly into the silence, "the sheriff's report on this man's death recorded a drunken fall. It said nothing of records. How is it that you know he died poking through the land office? How is it that you know he broke his neck?" Coyle opened his mouth, and nothing came out. And in the front row, Sheriff Pruitt, who had rolled his cigarette and written drunken fall in his book a year ago, went a sick shade of pale because Pruitt could read a room too, and Pruitt could see which way this was going to fall, and Pruitt was already, you could see it, calculating how to be on the other side of it. That was the moment the whole thing turned. Not the ledger, not even the seal. It was Thaddeus Coyle, undone by his own certainty, hanging himself with one sentence in front of 40 witnesses, because he had never once in his life imagined a room he could not command. Judge Horace Whitfield set down the forged patent. "I have heard enough," he said, "to know that I have not heard enough. This is no longer a foreclosure. The patent before me is forged. A federal crime beyond this court's spring term and beyond this county entirely." He looked at Coyle, and his voice was the voice of a man who had waited a long career to use it. "Thaddeus Coyle, you will be held, and the territorial marshal will be sent for from Helena, and the patent numbers in this ledger will be put before the General Land Office in Washington, and the death of this man will be reopened and properly examined. The foreclosure is denied. The Calder family will keep its land, pending the federal inquiry." A pause. "And, Sheriff Pruitt, you will surrender your report and your notes to this court before you leave this room. All of them." Uproar. Again, but a different uproar. The sound of a county, realizing the most powerful man in it was not after all more powerful than the truth held steady by a woman who would not look away. They took Coyle out in the marshal's chains 3 weeks later, when the man rode in from Helena with the answer from Washington, and the answer from Washington was that not one of the patent numbers in the old man's ledger matched a single genuine record in the General Land Office, that every last one was carved and forged, and that on the strength of the ledger, the seals, the reopened inquiry into the old man's death, and the testimony of a clerk named Pruitt, who had decided very quickly which side of it he wished to be on, Thaddeus Coyle would not be coming back to Yellowstone County a free man. Lavinia Coyle left town before the snow was fully off the peaks. The county that had whispered Della Brandt's name all winter could not, it turned out, get far enough away from the Coyle name, fast enough, and the women who would not meet Della's eyes in that courtroom were the first in the weeks after to find reasons to call at the homestead with a pie or a bolt of cloth, and Della received them all the same way, with coffee and no grudge, because she had learned long ago that the people who look away when you are down are simply afraid, and fear is a thing she had decided not to hold against anyone, having carried so much of it herself. The stolen claims came back. That was the part Della was proudest of in the end, prouder than of anything that touched her own family. The Hendersons, the widow Tarbell, the Pole brothers, name after name in the old man's ledger families put out on the road so a man in a fine coat could grow fat, and one by one as the federal inquiry ground forward, their land was restored, and more than one of them rode out to the Calder place to take the hand of the tall German woman who had read what no one else could and would not let it lie. But there was one more truth still buried, and it was the hardest one, because Eli still did not know. Della had carried it all winter, and through the trial, and into the green of that first true spring, the knowledge of who Eli really was, the orphaned son, the rightful heir, the living proof of the worst thing the old man ever did, and the best thing, too. The old man had begged her to find the gentle way, the right time. And there had never been a right time, because there is no right time to tell a man that the father he buried was not his blood, and that the home he grew up in was built on the ruin of his own. She told him on an evening in early June, when the worst was over and the land was safe, and she judged at last that a man can only be protected from the truth for so long before the protecting becomes its own kind of lie. She did not do it alone. She brought Ransom and Asa, because a man should not learn a thing like this without the people who love him in the room. And she put the old man's first letter in Eli's hands, the long one, the confession, and she let him read it himself in his father's own careful, late-learned hand, because some truths a person needs to receive directly and not through another's mouth. Eli read it in silence, and when he reached the end he sat for a very long time, and the cabin was quiet around him, and Asa was crying, and Ransom had his jaw set hard, and Della simply waited the way she had learned to wait, giving him the room to fall apart and put himself back together without anyone reaching in. And at last Eli looked up, and his face was wet, and he said the thing that told Della she had done right to tell him. "He found me," Eli said. His voice was wrecked and wondering. "He did a terrible thing, and then he spent his whole life. He came back and he found a baby that was nothing to him, that was only his guilt, and he raised me first. He loved me." He pressed the letter to his chest. "I always knew he loved me best. I felt guilty about it my whole life, that he loved me a little more than the others, and I never knew why, and it was because of this. Because every day he looked at me he remembered, and he loved me anyway, harder, to make it right. To make it right," Della said softly. And then Eli understood the other part, the part about the land, and Della watched it land on him, and she watched him turn to look at Ransom and Asa with a kind of horror. Because the letter said the homestead was rightfully his alone, by blood and by the original filing, and Eli, who had just learned he was not their blood, now learned he could, if he wished, take everything and leave his brothers nothing. I did not even take a breath to consider it. "No," Eli said. "No, this land is ours, the three of us. It was always the three of us." He looked at his brothers. "He raised me as a Calder. I will not become something else because a dead man's paper says I can. The claim is mine. Good. Then I am glad it is mine, because it means I can give it freely to my brothers, and no man can ever take it from us again, because now there is a true heir holding it, and Coyle's forgeries die against a real claim." He almost laughed through his tears. Pa was right. I was always the answer. I just thought he meant I was the problem. And that, in the end, was the gift the old man had been trying to give all along, reaching up out of a year in the ground to give it. Not just the land, the knowledge, finally received, and finally believed that the son he had wronged the most was the son he had loved the most, and that the love had been real, and that it had been enough. There was one last thing in the violin case. Della had read the old man's first letter many times by then, the confession, the one about Eli. But there had been a second sheet folded behind it, the very last page that she had not understood the first time and had set aside, and it was only that June evening after Eli that she took it out again and read it properly, and understood what the old man had done. Because the old man, it turned out, had not only been arranging a witness. The last page was the part of the letter meant for the woman herself, for whoever she turned out to be. I am asking a stranger to carry my family's deliverance," the old man had written. "That is a great deal to ask of a woman I will never meet. So I will tell you what I hope, though. I have no right to hope it. My oldest son, Ransom, is the loneliest man I have ever known. He is good all the way through, and he cannot say a word of it, and he has built himself a life designed to need no one, the way a man does when he has lost his mother young and decided love costs more than it pays. I do not need you to marry him. You owe me nothing least of all that. But if you are the woman I think the agency will send, the kind of woman with a clear mind and a steady hand and no fear of hard things, then you are exactly the kind of woman who could see what is underneath my son. And if you should ever come to love him and you then know that you have my blessing, and that an old man dying in the cold went to his grave a little warmer for hoping it. I asked for someone who could save my sons. I find I'm also hoping selfishly for someone who could make at least one of them happy. Forgive an old man 2 wishes where he had a right to none. Della read it twice. And then for the second time in this whole long story, the German woman who did not weep wept, because she had thought she was ordered as a tool. She had been wounded to her core, to learn she was brought west to read a ledger and not to be loved. And here in a dead man's last words sealed in her own violin case for more than a year was the proof that the old man had hoped from the very beginning for exactly the thing that had happened. That she would not only save his sons but be loved by one of them. That she would be not a tool but a daughter. She had not been ordered as a thing. She had been hoped for as a person. She showed the last page to Ransom that night, and he read his dead father's hope for him in his father's own hand, and the enormous silent man put his face in his scarred hands at the table where it had all begun, and for the second time she stood with him while he wept, and this time she did reach in because the time for not reaching in was over. And they had a whole life now in which to reach. Ransom and Della Calder ranched in the Yellowstone Valley for 42 years. They had 5 children. Della taught every one of them to read before they turned 5, and Ransom taught every one of them to work before they turned 7. And to a child they grew up unable to remember a time when the cabin was not full of books and music and the low, rare sound of their father's laugh, which their mother could still, even in old age, draw out of him more reliably than anyone alive. The bookshelf grew. The first one, the pine one, with the carved leaves, stayed by the hearth its whole life, but Ransom built her another and then another until there were shelves on every wall, 9 of them in the end, and they were never empty, because a Calder who rode to Billings came home with a book the way other men came home with whiskey. Asa became a lawyer, a real one. He read the law in Helena and passed the territorial bar, and spent 30 years putting men like Thaddeus Coyle behind bars with paper instead of guns, and he never once in all those years took a case he did not believe in, because he had watched as a young man what a clever, wicked man could do with a forged seal and a frightened county. And he had also watched a German woman with a clear mind take that man apart in a feed store courtroom with nothing but the truth held steady, and he had decided that was the kind of lawyer he wanted to be. Eli stayed. He married late a widow from the Tarbell place whose land Della had helped win back, and he raised his own children on the homestead that was by law his and that he had given freely to all 3 of them. And he never again, his whole life, stood with his back not quite to the open, because a man who has finally learned that he was loved best, and why can at last put his back to a wall and rest. And the violin played every Sunday evening, for as long as Della's hands could hold the bow, the old wild tunes from a country none of the children had ever seen. Filling a cabin that had once heard no music for years, pushing back the dark and the cold and the pressing weight of the mountains, and not one of those children ever knew growing up that the case it lived in had once carried a dead man's deliverance sealed beneath the felt. Because some, once they have done their work, are best left to be only what they appear. An old instrument, beloved, played on a Sunday by a mother whose hair had gone from honey to silver, and whose eyes were still the exact blue of cornflowers and just as unafraid. Ransom Calder died in the winter of 1924, at the age of 77, in his own bed in the cabin he had built with his wife's hand in his and most of his children and grandchildren within a day's ride. Della buried him on the rise above the homestead, beside his father, in the family plot, where more than 40 years before, on the night before a hearing, she had once knelt in the snow with a tin of buried evidence and a rifle held steady at her back, pointed down the long road toward town. She did not weep at his graveside. People who saw her would say later that she did, and they would be wrong, the way the county had always been a little wrong about her, because she was not a woman who wept where others could see. She knelt in the snow beside the fresh grave, an old woman now in a good wool coat, and she laid her violin down upon the dark earth. Just for a moment, the way you leave a thing with someone you are not ready to leave, and she did. Arithmetic. Cold, exact, grateful arithmetic. Counting the years, counting the children, counting all the warmth a cold and dying man had hoped for her one winter long ago, and all of it, every bit of it, had come true. Then she picked the violin back up, because she was not done playing yet, and she lived on in that valley 15 more years until 1939, when she was 83, and they laid her down at last beside him on the rise, where they could both see the land they had built. The land. A dead man's letter had saved the land a German woman had crossed a world to keep. He ordered a wife. She arrived, determined to be nothing he expected, and what they built was so much greater than anything either of them had thought to ask for, because the best things in a life are almost never the things we order. They are the things that arrive against all our planning and refuse to be what we asked for, and turn out instead to be exactly what we needed. An old man knew that dying in the cold and hoped for it across his own death. A lonely man learned it the day a tall woman stepped off a train and told him his chin was better in person. And a woman who had spent her whole life being other people's pictures, finally in a hard valley under the crazy mountains, became no one's picture at all, and in becoming nothing that anyone had ordered became everything that mattered to a family, to a county, and to one quiet man who could never find the words, and so set it all in pine and carved leaves, and a shelf built with room to grow. So let me leave you tonight with the question that old man left in a violin case, the one I think he was really asking underneath all the rest. When did you last let something arrive in your life that you did not order? Something that refused to be what you asked for, and turned out to be the thing you needed most of all. Tell me. I will be reading.